Hello, happy Friday. In a not surprise, we are again in front of this dang white wall because it is still very hot in that I have to keep my AC running in the front room because I've got a window unit. It has to be on at full blast to keep the rest of the apartment cool. So here we are. Maybe I'll figure out a more visually exciting situation at some point. Maybe I won't. Let's be honest about the odds. I am saying more to myself, obviously. Anyway, today we're going to talk about a book as usual. Today that book is Yerba Buena by Nina LaCour, who is a very popular young adult author, and this is her first adult title. We're back with that shiny library cover again as well. So her first adult book, her last big book, I think her last book was Watch Over Me, which I reviewed, talked about, I should say, and a lot of people really enjoyed that title. And she's built a brand for me as a reader as kind of exploring this beautiful sadness in her work, even though some of her early young adult falls more in the traditional kind of romance rom-com. I would not say com. We're not really laughing in her work generally. And that's not a judgment. It's just, let's call it what it is. If it's a rom-com, it should be funny in some way, though they don't always succeed. Regardless, her first works that I read, I think like Everything Leads to You, some variation of that title, was a little bit more straight romantic. Her co-authored book piece with David Levithan, similar. And I haven't read all of her work by any means, so I'm not an expert, but positioning this particularly against Watch Over Me and We Are Okay, I think is where this emotionally sits. And it's also very different in a lot of ways because it's her first adult book. So what does that mean from this particular author is part of what we're going to discuss. So this follows Sarah and Emily, who are both young women in California. A sense of place is always something I get from Nina LaCour's work, and it's no different here. That being said, I am born and bred in the Midwest. So while there is a definite sense of place that she communicates to me as a reader, I am not able to tap into the greater emotion or depth of what she's doing with those particular places. And I know that there is a lot of thought and intention put into that because it's one of those things that you can tell. You can tell when an author is thinking about that. And place comes into the title of the book as well with Yerba Buena, and we kind of get this repeated imagery of this particular plant. So there is the place there as well. So we're following Sarah and Emily as they grow up out of late adolescence and into adulthood and early adulthood. And so the book flap, the blurb, if you will, of the book really made me think it was going to be a romance. And it definitely has romance in it, but I want to be clear that as a reader, what I got were the journeys of these two young women and how they kind of wove in and out of each other, but the romance wasn't the central theme of it. While the shape of the thing did kind of lean in certain ways that way, it wasn't the driving factor. For me to be a romance, you have to have the happily ever after or the happily for now, and the romance really has to be the central thing. This was much more a character study. It was very episodic, and it took us through different eras of these young women's lives. And so we start with them both when they're teenagers and they're going through a great upheaval in their lives. So as I kind of touch on this, I'm going to try not to spoil big things, but I'm definitely going to spoil some things, so be aware of that. Also, I'm going to link the story graph, trigger warning, content warnings below because I know I won't be able to touch on all of them. I will forget some, and I think that there are a lot. So just be aware of that, and I think that if that's something that you need to take a look at, definitely do. So please just be aware of those and be kind to yourself because the tone of the book does have a weight to it. There is a grief and a heaviness to this. So it's not like it is miring us as readers in that hopelessness by any means, but it is a little bit more cynical, I would say, than like Watch Over Me or We Are Okay. And I think that this is where we kind of start to see the differences. We see a lot of the similarities in terms of tone, in place and how all of this is sculpted, in that our protagonists have been through some things and they have a sadness to them and they are overcoming something and looking to a future. But where with the young adult, we feel like we're kind of overcoming something. And I definitely do think we feel like we're overcoming something here, but we are looking forward in the young adult in many ways, in the way the narrative is presented and how we are thinking about the structure, the lives of our characters, this, that, and the other. And here it feels like we are looking backward as much as we are looking forward. So we're getting this backstory for our characters. We're starting at kind of the source of their trauma because it explains where they end up. And then we get to see what they make for themselves and what they build toward. And in theory, I would have better words for that. But it feels a little bit more jaded, a little bit more cynical without being totally devoid of hope. There is still a beauty in this sadness, but it has a lot more weight to it because we can see how it impacts these characters' lives. As adults, we see this grief linger in tangible ways that impact the shape and trajectory of their lives. And so there's a sadness to that in some ways, this idea that the things in our past can linger and can impact us as adults. And we know that. I think all of us know that, but there is a hope to some of the other narratives. And I do still think that there's a hope here, but our characters have to fight for it in much different ways, because I think all of Nina LaCour's characters are fighters in many ways. And I think if you like the protagonists in like a Courtney Summers novel, I think this is a similar kind of protagonist with a much more lyrical kind of tone to the writing. I think that she is still very lyrical here, very fluid, even as we're jumping quite a lot. And the chapters are very long because we're taking a look at large chunks, large pieces of these women's lives. We're kind of getting the snapshots before a change, and then we might get reference to something we'd seen before, or the blanks that are left in the narrative when we skip ahead will get filled in later. So that's an interesting way to do things, and I think it managed to still feel fluid and cohesive. But because of this as well, there is a languidness to the tone. It is a very slow-moving novel, especially because it's not always clear what we're building toward. It's very character-driven. And so if you're going into this expecting a romance trajectory, our characters don't meet, I think, until maybe the first third of the book, and they're still not really present in each other's lives in a really significant way until at least halfway through, I want to say. And so the shape of the thing is not centered around that relationship. In the same way that Honey Girl, I wouldn't necessarily call a romance, but it was definitely a factor and a driving force in the self-discovery for our character in that book. Here, I think that we've got two protagonists that we're kind of shaping everything around. And because of that, sometimes I feel like we do get a little bit lost on the path. It can be easy to get lost amidst the sprawl of the narrative, and because so much of the narrative is anchored by this kind of casual sadness, there is definitely a weight to that. And reading this while I am personally going through just kind of a sadder time in my life, and I mean that like sometimes you just feel sad for a while. That's kind of what this book feels like. At one point, Emily basically describes depression. I'm not saying I'm depressed by any means, but this kind of like low-level fog is what the narrative kind of feels like. And so it's walking us as readers through this real emotional turmoil for our characters. And if you're in like a sadder period in your life, or if you're going through something, that might be a hard place to be. And while the book is tight, it's under 300 pages. That's kind of a hallmark of LaCour, I would say, and I found it interesting to see that translated to this adult fiction that is a little bit more sprawling. The timelines of her young adult feel a little tighter, even when maybe not. Like, I feel like We Are Okay maybe was across the span of a year, which still is less time than this book, which spans at least a decade. And in that, I would say, I guess the most resounding themes are about home and resilience, because both of these young women are trying to find home, or have left home, or feel out of place in their home and are trying to find a new sense of that and what that means, and the resilience of that search, especially through some of the things they have to go through. But it also feels a little less cohesive than some of her other narratives have felt to me. I think Watch Over Me just felt so tight and so threaded by this real emotional resonance that wove throughout. It felt anchored by that sense of song to the song Watch Over Me, even if it wasn't always textually explicit. And here we were trying to bind these decades together, mainly through this repeated imagery of the plant of Yerba Buena. And so I have to wonder if maybe if I had a little bit more sense of that plant, of the place, if that would have felt a little bit more cohesive to me personally. And I think the sprawl is part of it. And I think part of it too is about finding your way back. We start in the woods as adolescents within the narrative itself. And I think that that's significant because I think this idea of being lost in the woods is a kernel that can sit with us. And so even when we get lost amidst this sprawl narratively, we're always finding our way back. And I think one of the lines later in the book that really cemented where this narrative was rooted emotionally for me was fine for something so healing to have a tinge of heartbreak too. It's definitely about that process of heartbreak and the healing from heartbreak, and heartbreak in different ways. We've got the heartbreak of lost love. We've got the heartbreak of family and family torn asunder, of feeling lost, of feeling forgettable, of feeling like you're a person that someone can just leave behind, and the real kind of intricate sadness of those emotions, of those real subtle insecurities that needle. And we've seen what has contributed to those building up, but all of that sadness lingers and kind of hangs out in the tone of this novel. And so clearly that emotionally impacted me. It was emotionally resonant. I had an emotional reaction, response to this work. And I think that there is a subtlety to the way she crafts her language. Well, I don't know. I guess it's not subtle. It's languid. It's not subtle in the sense that it is very clear how intentional she's being. The craft is evident. And so as much as I'm like, man, that was sad, also there's a skill in that. So often narratives are trying to bring an emotional reaction, to elicit an emotional reaction, and they can often fail. It can feel forced. And here I don't think it felt forced. It was all very gradual. It was all very subtle. And that kind of languidness that meandered down the path or off the path is what built that sadness so that we could unpack it and build something more beautiful from it. And I think that the attention to detail is evident and emphasized in the book. It talks about Sarah in particular, who becomes a bartender later, and she talks about how specific she is with ingredients, but also just how a slight moment, the slight details of a moment can be celebrated, but also can change the course of a life. She talks about having her first drink, just a sip, after getting her first apartment, after a great upheaval in her life, and just the celebration of that and the gravity of the moment and the way that we're able to kind of sit in that moment for a second. I think that there is a great skill in that. We can see the importance of that moment without like narratively trying to analyze it from every angle, but we can see how it has shaped the rest of the trajectory of a life and how Sarah is going back to that moment and trying to recreate moments for others. It also, potentially biggest spoiler time, has a plot line that I traditionally don't like very much. It does have an infidelity plot line, and often, I mean, it depends the kind of fiction. I think if we're looking at literary fiction about awful people doing awful things, I'm able to detach from it a little bit more, I think. Here, it's harder because I'm supposed to care about one of the people involved, and I'm not, as a reader, I never got a sense from the narrative that I was supposed to be rooting for these choices. It was always clear that it felt a little self-destructive in terms of what was going on, but we were still there for a bit and we had to live in that space and it was kind of uncomfy. And that's after some more traumatic things that happen as well. And yet, like I said, it doesn't feel like it's ever exploiting that. Rather, it's showing the resiliency of these young women amidst these harder things in life. So yeah, there was a lot going on here. I do think at times it could have benefited from a little tightening, or maybe if it just had more of a through line throughout, like if maybe there was just something running through the whole thing, anchoring, solidifying, grounding, I don't know, more synonyms, the whole thing, so that when we sprawled, we didn't feel like we got too lost in that. But I think that there was just a beautiful sadness to this. There was a deceptive simplicity, and I think it was a really excellent character study and character-driven novel because it gave a lot of grace to these women, and it didn't judge, and yet it didn't feel like it was endorsing either. So yeah, it just felt compassionate to them, and it had LaCour's signature voice and tone for sure. And even if our protagonist's hope was a little bit more faded by adult cynicism here, they were still fighting and there was still hope. And I think that the way LaCour built out that hope and that promise and possibility for adults who may feel haunted by their past was really excellent. And I think that her tone was a lot of that. That being said, I do think it has a little bit, Watch Over Me didn't have a supernatural plot line per se, but it did feel like there were ghosts lingering on the side, that history was a ghost, the past was a ghost in that in some way. And here we should have felt haunted by some of it, I think, but it didn't feel the same. But the tone was still there and still signature and still really gorgeous. That being said, if you're really sensitive to sadness right now, I think that's definitely something to note, because even though there is an optimism here, there is still a lot of sadness. And also check the content warnings as well if you think that that is something that could unsettle you, because I don't want you to be blindsided by anything, because I don't think the narrative is attempting to blindside anyone by anything, but rather it is attempting to give these narratives a voice as well. So if you've read this, I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts, especially if you have thoughts about this in relation to the rest of LaCour's body of work, or whatever thoughts you've got, I'd be happy to hear them. But thanks for listening to mine. Read something good, like and subscribe if you feel like it. You know, every once in a while I have to say it, even though I know you know. And yeah, bye.